Today we're talking about the top risk and deployment patterns for Gen AI applications on public cloud. These are really important if you are looking to secure and understand what Gen AI risks may look like in an organization. First one, data exposure and privacy. Data being the fuel that drives AI, data exposure is the biggest risk any organization is looking out there for. Whether you're an enterprise or you're an individual user in an organization, there are protection tools you can deploy. However, and LLMs like DeepSeek have made the privacy conversation even more important, especially if you work for an organization that should not be sharing data with a country, which in the case of DeepSeek is China. So you should be mindful of the privacy policy that is being applied for the LLM, whether it's a free one, open source one, or something you pay money for. What does the privacy look like for that? And how can you protect the data that is being put into that LLM? My advice, keep all the sensitive data away and keep your LLM as dumb as possible. So send instructions, get instruction back, but do not share data if you can. It's practical. The other risk a lot of people have is a model misuse. Now, because you are probably using a model like ChatGPT, Claude, or another version on the internet, a model misuse could be quite common if you are perhaps using open source version that could be available and downloaded from Hugging Face. You may be using a local version for your own sanity of protection for security. However, that opens the door for hallucination and a lot more if you are not using a popular model, which is trained to not have hallucination. The moment you go down the path of having a model that has not been trained on the latest models, like the ChatGPTs of the world, the Claudes of the world, and maybe to some extent Grok, which still can hallucinate here and there. But the problem with that could be the risk of getting a unexpected output could result in a bad decision being made by the company. Now, there are guardrails you can implement so that models are not misused by continuously monitoring them for any changes, but also for monitoring for online announcements for any vulnerabilities or security vulnerabilities that may have been discovered for the model that you may be using and if it's prone to any hallucination. Now, being security, compliance and regulatory standards are important, especially if you work for a large organization and especially if you work for an organization where the data that you work with is private in the sense that if it's a PII or personal identifiable information, for example, it could be my passport, my driving license, my home address, any combination of information that if someone on the internet had, they could exactly point out where the studio is in my office and maybe even where my house is. That would be considered a breach of compliance and privacy for your customers who you have responsibility for. Thankfully, most people do follow the compliance standards and understand the regulation that you are applicable to when dealing with LLM and the data that you might have to work with Gen AI. That would be the number one step you have to do. Now, after you understand that, whether you're HIPAA compliant or GDPR or any other ISO standard or SOC 2 standard you may be looking at, then you can start configuring the services that you use to build your LLM. Most likely you are using cloud services like Amazon Bedrock or Azure AI services or Google AI services. You probably can consider including some guardrails and cloud compliance checks to know that the services that you're using are compliant and also the data that you're storing or using for your LLM model is in the right place where it should be. Now, it goes without saying, you also need to maintain audit logs across your entire system because that's what would be used to identify if something went wrong, who did that, and how did they work around it. Now, certain regulatory standards may require you to retain some information or data, whether it's an output from a LLM system or it's perhaps something which is just simple as what data has been put in and what was changed after the input and output was provided. That is something you have to work out with as well in your regulation standard. Now, another risk a lot of people have been talking about is the legal risk, which is the intellectual property risk, the licensing risk. I'm sure you've seen a lot of lawsuits being filed against copyright material being used by LLM models to train their data. If they have been pre-trained on perhaps a copyrighted data, or if they are using data which was supposed to be for commercial, which was not supposed to be for commercial use, but now the data has been used for commercial purpose, there could be a breach of license. You could also be in a breach of license if you're not complying to the terms of the LLM provider you may be using. Now that you understand the risks, some of the common deployment patterns include some kind of an API integration where you have your Gmail, Slack, or any other tool that you have that you've been using in your organization for a long time. You use the API capabilities of those applications to make API request to a LLM provider as an input, and you get some output back. Now that is something called an API integration. Now, if you are perhaps using it on your own application and you're trying to make it AI enabled, you probably would use a private endpoint inside your organization's network, but it may be talking to an external endpoint, or you may have a private locally hosted LLM provider that you may be locally hosting in your data center or in your cloud environment to ensure privacy and still being compliant. Now, obviously, there are hybrid models as well. Now, most likely you're using an API integration and a private endpoint as your AI-enabled application. That is a very common pattern being seen in companies these days. Now, when it comes to deployment, there are three technical risks you need to be aware of. One is the identity and access management. Who has access to the data that you are providing to the LLM to modify it? Perhaps the data can be changed. Who has the responsibility in your cloud provider to be able to change the model or the AI application or the infrastructure used for the AI? Now, encryption is a huge part of data security. Having access to the key and who owns the key, it would be a really important question in the world of securing an application that is AI enabled. Now, finally, the AI application you have would be hosted inside your data center or in your cloud environment. So the configuration of that network, so no external party can access it. And you continuously monitor it for any threats perhaps they may have. Perhaps you do regular pen tests as well, and making sure there are no public access available. So identity, maintaining encryption, and network security would be the three pillars you have to look at from a technical risk perspective. So that's the recap for the top risk and deployment patterns for AI. I hope you build safe AI out there. If you have any questions, drop it in a comment. Otherwise, I'll see you next one.